The night I walked into Sebastian Wolf's casino was the night I learned that sometimes the most dangerous man in the room is the one who decides to be kind. The rain was falling so hard that night the neon lights of Manhattan looked like they were melting across the pavement, red and gold reflections sliding over the windshield of my old Honda like warning signs I should have listened to. But I didn't turn around, because when your little brother calls you at midnight whispering that he's made a mistake he can't fix, you don't think about danger, you think about family. And that's how I ended up standing outside the glass doors of the most exclusive casino in the city, a place where the valet parked cars worth more than my entire student loan balance, and the men inside wore suits that probably cost more than my rent for a year. And the moment the doors opened, the sound hit me first, the quiet clicking of poker chips, the low hum of expensive conversations, the soft piano music floating somewhere above it all like the building itself was trying to pretend it was civilized. But something about the room felt different, heavier, like the air understood power in a way I didn't, and every person there seemed to know exactly where they stood except me. A 26-year-old woman in a borrowed dress scanning the room for the one face that mattered, my brother, and when I finally spotted him my stomach dropped, because he wasn't just standing at any table, he was sitting at the table, the one everyone else in the casino seemed careful not to get too close to. The high-stakes poker table under a chandelier the size of a small car, surrounded by men who looked calm in the way only extremely wealthy or extremely dangerous people ever do. And at the center of that table sat the man I had only heard about in whispers, Sebastian Wolf, a name that carried through Manhattan's business circles like a rumor nobody wanted to confirm out loud. The man who owned half the luxury buildings on the Upper East Side, and somehow knew everything that happened in the other half of the city too. And the strange thing was he didn't look like the kind of man who needed to raise his voice or slam a fist on a table to get attention, because when he lifted his eyes from the cards in his hand the entire room seemed to shift slightly, like gravity had quietly moved closer to him. Tall, composed, dark suit tailored perfectly, dark hair brushed back, a calm expression that made him look less like a gambler and more like someone watching a chess match he already knew the ending to. And the moment my brother saw me standing there, his face went pale in a way that made my heart pound, because that wasn't relief I saw in his eyes. It was fear, the kind that says you arrived too late to stop something important. And then the dealer's voice cut clean through the room announcing the stakes of the game. Numbers so big my brain almost refused to process them. And that was the moment Sebastian Wolf finally looked directly at me across the casino floor, his expression unreadable, but his attention suddenly very focused, and I had the strange, terrifying realization that whatever game was happening at that table had just changed the moment I walked through the door. I should have realized that the moment Sebastian Wolf looked at me, the game at that table was no longer just about cards. The dealer's voice continued calmly, listing chip values and confirming bets with the quiet professionalism of someone used to seeing numbers that could buy entire apartment buildings change hands in a single evening. But I barely heard any of it because my attention was locked on my brother Daniel, whose hands trembled slightly as he sat across from Sebastian with a stack of chips that looked small compared to the towers surrounding them. And when he glanced at me again, there was a silent apology in his eyes that told me everything before a single word was spoken. I moved closer to the table, my heart beating harder with every step across the polished marble floor, aware that the conversations around the casino had grown quieter, as if people sensed that something important was unfolding. One of the staff members gently stepped into my path, a tall man in a black suit with the calm posture of someone trained to handle difficult situations without raising his voice. He spoke softly, asking if I needed assistance. But before I could answer, Sebastian Wolf lifted one hand slightly from the table, and the man stepped aside without another word. It was a small gesture, almost effortless, but the authority behind it was unmistakable. I stopped a few feet from the table, close enough now to see the cards in Daniel's hand and the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead. The dealer cleared his throat and spoke again, announcing the current standing of the game. Daniel had already lost more money than I could comprehend. The final number sounded unreal when the dealer said it out loud. Over $3 million in chips sitting across the table in front of Sebastian Wolf. My stomach dropped. I leaned closer to Daniel and whispered his name, asking him what he had done. His voice was barely audible when he answered. He said he thought he could win it back. He said he had been sure he understood the game. But the way his eyes kept drifting towards Sebastian told me the truth. This was never a game he had any chance of winning. The dealer began to gather the cards for another round when Sebastian finally spoke, and the entire table went still in that quiet way people do when someone powerful decides it is time to be heard. His voice was calm, low, controlled. He asked Daniel if he understood the position he was in. Daniel nodded slowly, his shoulders tight. Sebastian studied him for a moment with an expression that was not cruel and not kind either, just thoughtful, like a man considering an interesting problem. Then his gaze shifted to me again. I felt it before I even realized he had moved his attention, that quiet pressure of someone assessing every detail. His eyes were sharp but not angry, and that somehow made the moment even more unsettling. He asked a simple question. Was I Daniel's sister? I nodded before my brain had time to think of a better answer. A faint murmur moved through the people standing around the table, as if the room had just realized a new piece of the story. Sebastian leaned back slightly in his chair, folding his hands together for a moment as though he were reconsidering the entire evening. Then he looked back at the dealer and said something that made the room go silent. He said the game was not finished yet. He said they would play one more hand. And then he calmly slid a stack of chips onto the table so large that even the dealer paused before speaking. $100 million. For a moment nobody moved. The dealer looked at the mountain of chips Sebastian Wolf had just pushed forward, and even he seemed to need a second to process the number. $100 million sat in the center of the table like a small city made of glass and gold. Conversations across the casino faded into a stunned silence, the kind that only appears when people witness something so absurdly expensive that their minds cannot quite accept it as real. My brother Daniel stared at the chips as if they might disappear if he blinked. His lips parted but no sound came out. I felt my pulse beating in my ears and realized everyone around the table had turned their attention toward Sebastian. Yet he looked completely relaxed, as if placing $100 million on a poker table was no more unusual than ordering coffee. His fingers rested loosely on the arm of his chair while he studied Daniel for a long moment. Then his gaze shifted to me again, calm and sharp in a way that made it feel like he was measuring more than just the situation. The dealer finally cleared his throat and asked the question that no one else seemed brave enough to say out loud. He asked Sebastian if that amount was the official stake for the next hand. Sebastian nodded once. Yes. The dealer asked Daniel if he accepted the wager. Daniel swallowed hard and glanced at me again. I shook my head immediately, stepping closer to the table. I told him to stand up and walk away. I told him nothing good could come from this. But Daniel's eyes moved from me back to the chips in the center of the table, and I could see the terrible calculation happening in his mind. One hand. One impossible chance to erase everything he had lost tonight. He whispered that if he won this hand the debt would disappear. I felt the weight of every person in the casino watching the exchange as if they had suddenly become part of the story. Before Daniel could answer the dealer, Sebastian spoke again. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the entire room without effort. He said the terms should be clear before the cards were dealt. If Daniel won, the entire debt would be erased, and the $100 million would be his. A ripple of disbelief passed through the crowd behind me. Even Daniel looked shocked by that offer. Then Sebastian continued speaking, his eyes moving toward me once more. If Daniel lost, the money would remain with Sebastian Wolf as expected, but the debt would not be Daniel's responsibility anymore. Instead, he said the wager would transfer to the person who had just walked into the casino for him. The meaning of his words settled over the table like cold air. I felt my breath catch as the realization formed. Sebastian had not placed that enormous stack of chips on the table for Daniel at all. He had placed it there for me. The dealer slowly repeated the condition, his voice careful and precise. If Daniel lost the hand, Emily Carter would leave the casino with Sebastian Wolf. No one spoke for several seconds. Daniel looked at me with pure panic now, understanding the trap he had stepped into. I should have been angry or afraid, but what I felt instead was a strange calm as I looked across the table at Sebastian. He did not look triumphant or cruel. He simply waited, patient and composed, like a man who already knew how the next few minutes would end. Daniel's chair scraped softly against the polished floor as he pushed himself halfway up from the table, his face pale under the golden lights of the casino. He shook his head quickly and said he would not accept the bet. His voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it, like the air in the room had grown too heavy for him to breathe properly. He told Sebastian that the debt was his mistake and that nobody else should pay for it. The words echoed awkwardly across the table, but Sebastian Wolf did not react the way anyone expected. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. Instead, he simply watched Daniel with that same calm, analytical expression, as if he were observing a chess player reconsidering a move. Then he leaned back slightly in his chair and looked at me again. The silence that followed stretched long enough that I could hear the soft ticking of the enormous chandelier above us. Finally, Sebastian spoke. He said something that shifted the entire mood of the room. He said Daniel misunderstood the situation. The bet had never been about forcing anyone into anything. The bet was about choice. His eyes stayed on mine when he explained it. Daniel had already risked millions chasing a chance he could not win. But now the decision belonged to someone else. If I walked away, the game would end immediately. Daniel would still owe the debt, and Sebastian would collect it in whatever legal way his business allowed. If I chose to stay and allow the hand to be played, Daniel would receive one final chance to clear everything in a single moment. The dealer remained perfectly still, waiting for confirmation before touching the cards again. Around the table, the crowd had grown larger. Men and women in expensive suits watched with quiet fascination, as if they were witnessing something more complicated than gambling. I felt Daniel's eyes on me, desperate and ashamed. He whispered that I should leave. He told me he would find another way to fix what he had done. But the truth hung in the air between us. We both knew there was no other way. $3 million was not a number people simply solved with hard work and good intentions. I looked across the table again at Sebastian Wolf. Up close, I could see that his expression had not changed since the moment he placed the chips down. There was no impatience in his posture, no pressure in his voice. He simply waited. The entire casino seemed to be holding its breath for my answer. My mind raced through every possibility. I thought about Daniel, about the countless times he had protected me when we were younger, about the stupid choices he had made tonight trying to prove he could be something more than the kid who always lost. I thought about the enormous stack of chips sitting between us, about the way one decision could erase everything or make it far worse. Finally, I straightened my shoulders and took one step closer to the table. The movement drew every eye in the room. Daniel shook his head again, whispering my name, but I did not stop. I looked directly at Sebastian Wolf and told the dealer to deal the cards. The dealer did not hesitate once the words left my mouth. His hands moved with the smooth precision of someone who had spent years dealing cards under the pressure of enormous stakes. The soft whisper of the deck sliding across the table seemed louder than it should have been in the silent room. Every person watching leaned slightly closer as the cards began to move. 2 cards to Daniel. 2 cards to Sebastian Wolf. The simple rhythm of the game felt almost unreal compared to the weight of what rested on the outcome. Daniel picked up his cards slowly, his fingers trembling so slightly that only someone standing close could see it. His eyes scanned the numbers, and for a brief moment hope flickered across his face. Not confidence, but hope. The fragile kind that appears when someone thinks the universe might still forgive them for their mistakes. Sebastian did not even lift his cards immediately. He allowed the dealer to finish the first round of betting before glancing down at his hand with a calm, almost bored expression. Then he placed a few chips forward, the motion so effortless it felt like he was moving pieces on a board he had already studied. Daniel matched the bet after a short pause. The dealer burned a card and revealed the first 3 community cards in the center of the table. A quiet ripple moved through the crowd as people tried to read the possibilities forming on the green felt surface. I did not understand much about poker strategy, but I understood tension. And the tension in that moment felt thick enough to touch. Daniel leaned forward slightly, studying the cards as if staring harder might change their meaning. Sebastian remained still, his posture relaxed, one arm resting against the chair, as if he had all the time in the world. When the next card was dealt, Daniel's breathing became more noticeable. The dealer waited for the next move. Daniel pushed a small stack of chips forward, clearly trying to appear confident even though the movement lacked the smooth control of someone comfortable with the stakes. Sebastian watched him for a moment that felt longer than it probably was. Then he matched the bet without a word. The final card was placed on the table. The river. Even I could sense that the outcome now rested in the cards Daniel already held in his hand. The dealer turned his attention to Sebastian first, asking, if he would check or raise. Sebastian looked down at the table again, then at Daniel, then finally at me. His expression had not changed. Calm, observant, as if this moment was less about winning and more about understanding the people sitting across from him. He pushed a final stack of chips into the center of the table. It was not a dramatic movement, just enough to make the pot impossible for Daniel to ignore. Daniel stared at the chips for several seconds. The casino remained completely silent except for the faint hum of the lights overhead. I could see the war inside his mind, the desperate calculation of risk and consequence. Finally, he exhaled slowly and pushed the rest of his chips forward. He said he would call. The dealer nodded once and gestured for the hands to be revealed. Daniel turned his cards first. A strong hand. Strong enough that several people behind us murmured in surprise. For a single heartbeat, I thought we might actually win. Then Sebastian Wolf calmly placed his cards face up on the table. The cards rested on the table between them for a moment that felt suspended outside of time. The dealer leaned forward slightly, studying the hands with professional focus before announcing the result. Sebastian Wolf had the stronger hand. It was not a dramatic victory. There was no celebration. Just a quiet, undeniable outcome. A low murmur passed through the crowd gathered around the table, the sound of dozens of people exhaling at once after holding their breath through the final reveal. Daniel's shoulders dropped the moment he understood. The small spark of hope that had carried him through the hand disappeared, replaced by a tired kind of acceptance. He leaned back in his chair slowly, staring at the cards as if they might still change their mind if he looked long enough. But they did not. The dealer calmly began collecting the chips from the center of the table, sliding the massive stack towards Sebastian with careful, practiced movements. $100 million returned to the man who had placed it there. Daniel ran a hand through his hair and whispered something under his breath that I could not quite hear. I stepped closer to him, resting my hand on the back of his chair for a second. He looked up at me with guilt written clearly across his face. He started to apologize, but I stopped him with a small shake of my head. What had happened could not be undone with apologies. Across the table, Sebastian Wolf remained exactly as he had been before the hand began, composed and still, watching everything with quiet attention. When the dealer finished arranging the chips, he stepped back respectfully, leaving the table clear except for the cards and the two men facing each other. Daniel finally pushed his chair back and stood up. For a moment it seemed like he might try to say something more, but the words did not come. Instead, he turned towards Sebastian and nodded once, a small gesture of acknowledgement that carried more weight than any speech. Sebastian returned the nod with the same calm politeness. Then his gaze shifted to me again. The attention felt different now that the game was over. Not sharper, not softer, simply deliberate. He rose from his chair with smooth, unhurried movement, straightening the cuff of his jacket as he stood. The crowd around the table instinctively stepped back to give him space, the same quiet respect that had followed him since the moment I entered the casino. When he spoke, his voice carried easily across the table even though he did not raise it. He said the game was finished. The debt was cleared exactly as promised. Daniel closed his eyes for a second as the meaning of those words settled in. The weight that had been hanging over him all night lifted in a single breath. But Sebastian was not finished speaking. He turned fully toward me and extended one hand slightly, not as a command, but as a simple invitation. He said it was time for the second part of the agreement. The room seemed to grow quieter again as every person watching realized the story was not ending here. I looked once more at Daniel. He shook his head faintly as if trying to protest, but the relief in his expression made it clear he understood the cost that had just been paid. I took a slow breath, straightened my shoulders, and stepped forward to meet Sebastian Wolf. I stepped toward Sebastian Wolf, and the entire casino seemed to shift around us, as if the room itself understood that something important had just changed. His hand remained extended for only a moment before he lowered it again, not impatient, not demanding, simply acknowledging that I had accepted the outcome of the game without needing to say it out loud. Up close, the noise of the casino returned slowly, the distant clinking of glasses, the soft music drifting from somewhere near the bar, the quiet conversations of people who were pretending they had not just witnessed one of the most expensive poker hands in the building's history. Daniel moved closer to me immediately, his voice low and urgent as he told Sebastian that the agreement had been about the game and that I did not need to go anywhere with him. There was desperation in my brother's tone now, the kind that appears when someone realizes the cost of their choices too late. Sebastian turned his head slightly toward Daniel, his expression still calm, almost thoughtful, as if he were considering how to answer a question he had heard many times before. He told Daniel that the agreement had been clear from the beginning and that he had honored every part of it. The debt was gone, completely erased. Daniel looked at the empty poker table as if he could still see the number hanging in the air. $3 million. Gone in a single hand. I placed a hand lightly on my brother's arm to stop him from speaking again. The damage had already been done. Sebastian had kept his word, and there was something strangely undeniable about that. I turned back toward him and asked the only question that felt real in that moment. I asked where we were going. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth, not arrogant, not mocking, just a small reaction to the fact that I had asked directly instead of arguing. He said we were not going anywhere far, just upstairs. The casino, he explained, had private suites for certain guests who preferred quiet conversations away from the main floor. Around us, the small crowd that had gathered near the table slowly began to disperse, though I could still feel curious eyes watching from across the room. Sebastian gestured toward the far side of the casino where a hallway lined with dark glass doors led away from the gaming floor. Two men in tailored suits who had been standing near the wall straightened slightly when he moved, clearly part of his security team, but careful to remain several steps behind rather than surrounding us. Daniel shook his head again, whispering that this was a mistake, but there was relief in his eyes now too, the kind that comes when someone realizes the worst outcome has been avoided. I told him quietly that everything would be fine and asked him to go home. It took him a moment to understand that I meant it. Finally, he nodded once, still looking uncertain, before stepping back from the table and disappearing into the moving crowd of the casino floor. When I turned again, Sebastian was already walking slowly toward the hallway, not looking back to see if I would follow, simply confident that I would. For a second, I stood alone beside the empty poker table where $100 million had just changed hands. Then I took a breath and walked after Sebastian Wolf. The hallway beyond the casino floor was quieter than I expected, the noise of the gaming tables fading behind us as the glass doors closed with a soft, almost polite sound. The lights here were warmer, softer, reflecting off dark wood panels and polished marble that made the corridor feel less like part of a casino and more like the private wing of an expensive hotel. Sebastian Wolf walked a few steps ahead of me with the same unhurried confidence he had shown at the poker table, his posture relaxed, his hands loosely at his sides, as if nothing unusual had happened tonight. I noticed that the two men who had been watching from the wall earlier followed us at a respectful distance, close enough to be present, but far enough to pretend they were not listening to anything we might say. For several seconds, neither Sebastian nor I spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable exactly, but it carried a strange awareness that the night had shifted into something neither of us had planned when we woke up that morning. Finally, he slowed slightly as we reached a set of private elevators at the end of the hall. The doors opened almost immediately when he pressed the button, as if someone upstairs had already been expecting him. We stepped inside and the doors slid closed behind us, leaving the distant sounds of the casino completely behind. For the first time since I had walked into the building, I felt the quiet settle around us. Sebastian pressed a single button for the top floor and leaned lightly against the wall of the elevator. The soft mechanical hum of the lift filled the silence as we began to rise. I crossed my arms loosely, trying to keep my voice steady when I finally spoke. I asked him why he had done it. The question hung in the air between us. He did not pretend to misunderstand what I meant. After a moment, he answered calmly, saying that people often confuse money with power. In his experience, the real power came from knowing when to use it and when not to. I frowned slightly, unsure whether that was meant to explain anything at all. He noticed the expression and gave a small smile that made him look almost amused for the first time that night. Then he said something that surprised me. He said the game downstairs had never really been about the cards. It had been about watching people. The elevator slowed gently as it reached the top floor, and the doors opened to reveal a quiet private lounge that looked out over the glittering lights of Manhattan. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city like a painting, the streets below glowing with yellow headlights and distant traffic moving like rivers of light between the buildings. Sebastian stepped out first and gestured toward the seating area near the windows. I followed him slowly, still trying to understand what kind of man would gamble $100 million simply to observe how people behaved when everything was on the line. He moved to a small bar near the wall and poured 2 glasses of sparkling water before handing one to me. His voice remained calm when he spoke again. He said that tonight had answered a question he had been wondering about all evening. I asked him what question that was. He looked at me steadily and said he had been wondering what kind of person would walk into a room like that casino and risk everything for someone else. For a moment, I did not answer him. The city lights stretched endlessly beyond the glass behind him, thousands of windows glowing in the night, like quiet witnesses to a world that never really stopped moving. I held the glass of sparkling water he had given me, but did not drink it yet. His question lingered in the air between us, heavier than the silence that followed. Finally, I said the first honest thing that came to mind. I said that most people would do the same thing for someone they loved. Sebastian tilted his head slightly, studying my face as if trying to decide whether I truly believed that. Then he walked slowly toward the window, resting one hand in the pocket of his jacket while he looked out over the city below. From this height, Manhattan looked almost peaceful. The traffic softened into quiet streams of light and the noise of the streets replaced by the distant hum of the skyline. After a few seconds he spoke again, his voice calm and thoughtful. He said that in his experience most people talked about loyalty, but very few actually practiced it when the stakes became real. Money changed things. Fear changed things. Opportunity changed things even faster. He turned back toward me and leaned lightly against the edge of the bar. The room felt larger now that the tension of the poker table was gone, but the conversation somehow felt more serious. I asked him why someone like him would care about a question like that. He looked at me for a moment before answering, as if deciding how much truth to offer. Then he said something simple. He said that running a city full of businesses required understanding people better than they understood themselves. Loyalty was rare. Integrity was even rarer. When he noticed it, he paid attention. I let out a quiet breath, trying to understand the strange logic of a man who could gamble $100 million simply to test an observation about human behavior. I told him there were probably easier ways to learn about people. That earned another small smile from him, this one slightly warmer. He admitted that there probably were, but he had never been very interested in easy answers. The silence returned for a moment, but it felt different now, less tense, almost reflective. I finally took a sip of the water and asked the question that had been forming in my mind since we stepped into the elevator. I asked what happened now. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he walked back toward the windows and looked out across the city again, as if measuring the distance between the towers and the streets below. When he spoke, his voice was steady and quiet. He said that technically the agreement from the poker table had already been fulfilled. I had come upstairs with him exactly as the terms required. I waited for the rest of the explanation, unsure whether I should feel relieved or suspicious. After a few seconds, he turned back toward me and said something I did not expect at all. He said that meant I was free to leave whenever I wanted. I stared at him for a second because the words did not make sense at first. Free to leave. After everything that had happened downstairs, after the tension of the poker table and the silence of the elevator ride, and the strange conversation overlooking the city, the idea that I could simply walk out of the room felt almost unreal. Sebastian Wolf watched my reaction carefully, as if he had expected the confusion. He did not rush to explain it. Instead, he took a slow sip from his own glass of water and set it down on the bar behind him. The lights of Manhattan reflected in the windows at his back, outlining his silhouette against the city like he belonged there more than anyone else in the building. I asked him why. The question came out before I could think of anything more clever to say. He did not pretend to misunderstand it. He said the agreement had been simple. If Daniel lost the hand, I would come upstairs with him. I had done exactly that. The condition was fulfilled. The moment stretched quietly between us while the meaning settled into place. He had spent $100 million in a game that ended with nothing more than a conversation and the clearing of my brother's debt. I shook my head slightly, trying to understand what kind of logic allowed someone to treat that amount of money as if it were simply part of a personal experiment. I told him most people would not call that a fair trade. Sebastian gave a small, thoughtful nod, as if acknowledging the point. Then he said something that made the room feel even quieter. He said fairness was rarely the point of power. Choice was. I crossed my arms slightly, studying him the way he had studied everyone at the poker table earlier. I asked him if he expected me to thank him for that. Philosophy. That earned another small smile from him, the kind that appeared briefly and disappeared before it could become anything too warm. He said he did not expect anything at all. That was the interesting part. Most people, he explained, tried to control the outcome of every interaction. Tonight, he had simply observed it. The city lights outside flickered across the glass as a helicopter moved somewhere in the distance between the towers. I looked down at the floor for a moment, replaying the entire night in my head. The phone call from Daniel. The rain outside the casino. The enormous stack of chips on the poker table. The final hand that had erased $3 million in debt with the turn of a few cards. And now this quiet room where the man responsible for all of it was calmly telling me I could walk away. When I looked up again, Sebastian was watching me with the same steady attention. He said something then that felt less like an observation and more like a genuine statement. He said that most people who walked into his world never left it unchanged. But tonight had been different. Tonight he had seen something he did not expect. I asked him what that was. His answer came without hesitation. He said courage was rare, and loyalty even more so. Then he gestured lightly toward the elevator behind me and said if I wished to go home, his driver would take me anywhere in the city. I remained where I was for a few seconds after he finished speaking, the quiet of the lounge settling around us again while the city lights shimmered across the glass walls behind him. The elevator waited silently a few steps away, its polished doors reflecting the room like a mirror that could carry me back down to the world I understood. Go home. The words should have felt simple, but after everything that had happened tonight, they felt strangely complicated. I looked at Sebastian Wolf again, trying to reconcile the calm man standing in front of me with the one who had just placed $100 million on a poker table as if it were part of an ordinary evening. He seemed perfectly comfortable with the silence, giving me time to think without rushing the moment. Finally I spoke. I asked him something that had been bothering me since we stepped into the elevator. I asked why he had really done it. Not the explanation about observing people. Not the philosophy about loyalty. The real reason. Sebastian studied my face for a moment, as if deciding whether the question deserved a deeper answer. Then he walked slowly back toward the window and looked down at the streets far below. From this height, the traffic lights changed like quiet signals in a world that never noticed the conversations happening above it. When he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful rather than mysterious. He said that people in his position spent most of their lives surrounded by individuals who wanted something. Money, influence, protection. Very rarely did he encounter someone who walked into the room with nothing to gain for themselves. Tonight had been different. I considered that for a second before answering honestly. I told him I had not been thinking about courage or loyalty or whatever lesson he believed he had discovered. I had simply been trying to help my brother. Sebastian nodded slightly, as if that answer confirmed something he had already guessed. He said that was exactly the point. Most people believed they understood who they were until the moment everything important was on the line. That was when real character appeared. I leaned lightly against the edge of the bar, still holding the glass he had given me earlier. I asked him whether he always tested strangers that way. His expression shifted just enough to suggest amusement. He said no. Only when the situation became interesting enough to be worth the risk. The word risk caught my attention. I reminded him that he had risked $100 million to learn that lesson. That seemed like a very expensive experiment. Sebastian gave a quiet laugh under his breath, the first real sign of warmth I had heard from him all night. Then he said something unexpected. He said the money had never truly been at risk. I frowned slightly, trying to understand what he meant. He explained it calmly. The outcome of the hand had never been the most important part of the game. What mattered was seeing what people would choose when the pressure became impossible to ignore. I shook my head, still not sure whether that explanation made him brilliant or completely unreasonable. Finally, I set the glass down and stepped toward the elevator. I pressed the button and the doors opened almost instantly. Before stepping inside, I looked back at him one last time. He was still standing near the window, the city lights behind him, watching me with that same quiet attention. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I thanked him for clearing Daniel's debt. Sebastian gave a small nod in return and said that sometimes the most valuable things in the world were not the ones people tried to buy. Then the elevator doors closed between us. The elevator descended quietly through the building, the soft mechanical hum filling the space where conversation had ended. I watched the numbers above the door change one by one as the floors passed beneath us, each one bringing me farther away from the strange night that had begun with a desperate phone call and a rain-soaked drive across Manhattan. When the doors opened again, the familiar sounds of the casino floor returned, the distant shuffle of cards, the low conversations, the faint music drifting through the air like nothing unusual had ever happened. For a moment I stood there, adjusting to the brightness and the movement after the quiet of the private lounge upstairs. People walked past me carrying drinks, laughing softly, placing bets at tables that probably held more money than I would earn in a lifetime. None of them knew how close my life had come to changing completely only a few minutes earlier. I stepped out of the elevator and began moving toward the exit. The polished marble floor reflected the lights above, guiding me past the gaming tables and velvet ropes that separated different sections of the casino. Some of the staff glanced at me as I passed, their expressions polite but curious, as if they recognized the woman who had stood beside the high-stakes poker table earlier that night. Near the front entrance, a man in a dark suit approached quietly and introduced himself as the driver Sebastian had mentioned. He spoke respectfully and asked where I would like to go. For a second I hesitated, still processing how quickly everything had changed. Just an hour earlier my brother had been facing a debt that could have followed him for years. Now it was gone, as if the number had never existed. I gave the driver my apartment address, and he nodded, opening the door for me as we stepped outside. The night air felt cooler than before, the rain finally stopping, but leaving the streets shining under the city lights. A black sedan waited at the curb, its engine already running. As we pulled away from the casino, I looked back once through the rear window. The building stood tall against the skyline, its glass walls glowing softly against the dark sky like a beacon for the kind of world I had just stepped into and out of again. The ride across Manhattan was quiet. Traffic moved steadily through the streets while pedestrians hurried along the sidewalks carrying umbrellas and late-night coffee cups. The driver did not ask questions, and I did not feel the need to explain anything. I leaned back against the seat and allowed the events of the night to replay in my mind. The poker table, the mountain of chips, the calm voice of a man who treated $100 million as if it were simply another move in a larger game. By the time the car stopped in front of my building, the city had begun to settle into the slower rhythm of early morning. I thanked the driver and stepped out onto the sidewalk, the familiar entrance of my apartment building suddenly feeling very small compared to the world I had just left behind. As the car drove away, I stood there for a moment, looking up at the dark windows above me. The night had started with fear and ended with something I still could not quite name. Relief, confusion, maybe even a strange kind of gratitude. But as I walked toward the door, I could not shake the quiet feeling that somewhere high above the city, Sebastian Wolf was still watching the lights of Manhattan and thinking about the choices people made when everything was on the line. The next morning arrived quietly, the pale light of sunrise slipping through the thin curtains of my apartment and spreading across the floor like the city itself was gently reminding me that the night before had actually happened. For a few seconds after waking up, I lay still, staring at the ceiling and wondering if the entire thing had been some strange dream brought on by stress and too little sleep. Then my phone buzzed softly on the nightstand beside the bed. The message was from Daniel. He said he was safe. He said he had not slept at all and that he still could not believe what had happened. I stared at the words on the screen for a moment before typing back that everything was going to be fine and that he should focus on fixing the things in his life that had led him into that casino in the first place. After sending the message, I sat up and looked out the window. Morning traffic had already begun moving along the street below, taxis and delivery trucks weaving through the early rush of Manhattan like the city had never paused for the events of the night before. For everyone else, it was just another Tuesday. But for me, the world felt slightly different. Later that afternoon, I stopped by the small coffee shop on the corner near my building, the same place I had visited hundreds of times before without thinking twice about it. The familiar smell of roasted coffee beans and fresh bread filled the room, while people sat with laptops or newspapers, talking about work, weather, and ordinary problems that suddenly felt very far away from the quiet lounge overlooking the city skyline. I ordered a coffee and sat near the window, watching pedestrians move along the sidewalk. For a moment, the entire experience felt surreal. Less than 12 hours earlier, I had stood beside a poker table where $100 million had been pushed across the felt as if it were part of a casual conversation. The door of the coffee shop opened and a gust of cool air moved through the room as another customer stepped inside. I barely noticed at first until the barista called my name and handed me my drink. As I turned back toward the window, I saw something outside that made me pause. Across the street, a black sedan waited at the curb. It was not unusual in Manhattan to see expensive cars parked along the street, but there was something about the quiet patience of the vehicle that caught my attention. The driver sat behind the wheel looking forward calmly, not in a hurry, not checking a phone, simply waiting. I watched for a moment before the realization slowly formed in my mind. The same car had taken me home the night before. The same driver had opened the door. Outside the casino, my heart beat a little faster as I stood there holding the coffee cup in my hands. Just as I was about to look away, the rear passenger window lowered slightly. Inside the car, I saw Sebastian Wolf sitting calmly in the back seat, dressed in the same effortless confidence he had worn the night before. He did not wave or call my name. He simply met my eyes through the glass for a quiet second and gave a small nod, the same respectful acknowledgement he had offered across the poker table. Then the window rose again, and the car pulled smoothly into traffic, disappearing into the moving river of vehicles on the street. I stood there for several seconds after it was gone, staring at the empty space where it had been. And in that moment, I understood something simple about the strange man who had changed my life in a single night. Some people used money to control the world around them, but Sebastian Wolf used it to reveal it. And sometimes the most powerful move in any game was not winning at all, but choosing to walk away.